When you really think about it, the idea of disclosure has been with the UFO field since the very beginning, since we've known about flying saucers in the 1940s. And the question really is, will we ever have a moment in our world where this subject of UFOs is openly acknowledged by all elements of our society, including scientific establishments and political institutions? During the Second World War, 1945, when the first atomic bomb is detonated in history. We've never done this before. Are these beings interested in us because they see that we have unlocked this incredible secret, this major universal secret, that of the atom and nuclear technology? Why do the governments of the world feel the need to hide these objects that have been observed to travel at speeds that we don't really understand, how they can move the way they do, stop on a dime, take off instantly? Why the secrecy? These are the great unanswered questions of the UFO phenomenon. Someone, something is in control of them.
Researcher and author Tim Beckley had always loved the Hawaiian Islands. He had visited there not just for a vacation, but also for research purposes several times. He had collected a large number of stories regarding the strange unidentified objects that are often seen before disaster strikes in the way of volcanic activity. Before he went on his Hawaiian quest, he had heard about the strange phenomenon of fireballs from Art Johnson, an actor, comedian, and at one time a regular on TV series. He had been a stringer for The Enquirer and some of the lesser tabloids and regularly interviewed celebrities. To satisfy Tim's curiosity, he was always tossed in a question or two pertaining to any belief or experiences with UFOs or the paranormal they might have had. Quite often, he was rewarded with a fascinating story. Art revealed that he and his wife had been making pilgrimages to the islands for quite a few years and had made friends with the kahuna, the local shamans who have learned to utilize the powers of the mind to their fullest extent, enabling devotees to walk on fiery coals and to perform other feats of mind over matter. Because of their willingness to accept that which is often considered taboo, Art said that the kahuna had both taken him and Gisela into their confidence and have shown them what they consider to be the relentless wanderings of the dead. There's a place on the Big Island, said Art, where you can see lights, which the locals believe to be the spirits of unworthy souls, those who have not found their way into the equivalent of the Hawaiian heaven. We've seen that many times. They're fireballs in the distance, and they travel from right to left over the harbour at Kona. They travel the same path all the time. The natives claim that in order to keep them away, you must swear at them. Well, since we started seeing them, we've learned to swear a lot, they said. According to the entertainer, the meandering lights will often arrive in groups of 2 or 3 and then split up before they drop down below the horizon. Johnson admits that they were baffled. Personally, he says, I have no idea what these can be. The only airport in the area closes at sundown, so those lights don't come from it, and we have seen these things at 1 or 2 in the morning. There certainly remains a big question in my mind. Until I find the answer, I have to think that maybe the natives are right and that we're actually seeing ghostly apparitions. That's as good an explanation as any. Before going to Hawaii, Tim never thought to believe in anything along these lines, but he found that many of the Hawaiian so-called superstitions have a basis in reality. Believe it or not, the islanders have a name for their UFO or spook lights. They identified the spectres as akulate, which often appear at night, taking on the form of fireballs shooting across the sky. Most often, the Akualaiti are thought of by Hawaiians as either ancestral or nature spirits. Mind you, they don't dismiss them as being extraterrestrial in origin. It's not just a theory that is easily applicable to their magically inclined heritage. An 88-year-old woman living at the Monalani Heights on Oahu said that in 1940 she was startled by a bright light at her front door. It was a fireball. She said that someone in her family was against her. She prayed for divine guidance, and in a dream that night she learned that one family member was jealous of her. Residents believe these fireballs are somehow spiritual in some way, and that such a phenomenon can be warned off through swearing at them through prayer. Tim also learned that a male Hawaiian living in the Kailua area of the Kona coast of Hawaii said that when he was a young man, a fireball of bright yellow light crashed through the air and flew over and under some trees. He was just about to swear at it when the akulate smashed into a tree and exploded into lots of small flames. Fireball witnesses are apparently plentiful. Tim had no trouble in finding people who'd seen them. One young man told him that while he was driving down the Old Pali Road on Hua, a fireball passed slowly in front of his car. The engine died, but as soon as the fireball left, the engine kicked in again. Such actions are more commonly reported in close proximity UFO encounters. In another case, two men were driving along the same Old Pali Road when a fireball appeared. The driver stopped the car, got out, and started to swear. The fireball broke up into smaller balls before disappearing. In another case, a 17-year-old female once saw a fireball hovering above her head at about 50 feet. It spun in flight and then crashed to the ground. A man and his wife spotted a huge luminous blue fireball that fell almost at their feet. When the wife tried to touch it, it reared up and flew away. It is true to state that Earth lights have been long associated with erupting volcanoes. A couple of years back, Tim flew to Costa Rica. On our way, he said he stopped wherever he could. On one occasion, he was near to a volcano. He had a bite to eat at a restaurant where the lady proprietor spoke English. When he mentioned UFOs, her eyes lit up. They'd been all around the volcano for years. The locals believe that the objects draw on the energy of the volcano Arenal. The Arenal lights, he was told, are most often described as blazing stars or flying flames. Seen at night, they're bright green or orange like the end of a hot poker. Supposedly, there's some sort of hidden base beneath the volcano. Likewise, in Popocatépetl, Mexico, UFOs had been seen and photographed skyrocketing in and out of the active volcano over the course of the last few years. Tim was also told that there may have been many sightings of Earth lights in the twilight around Mount St. Helens in Washington, just above its rim at 8,300 feet. Many of these luminous objects were just seen before Mount St. Helens' last major eruption, and there was another spate of UFOs seen there between 2004 and 2005. One of his extensive researches has shown that the volcanoes of Hawaii may have strange sightings around them. More recently, residents of the Hawaiian island of Oahu were left baffled as a mysterious blue-colored object streaked across the night sky before plunging into the nearby ocean. Witnesses shocked at what they saw called 911 to report their sightings of the unidentified flying object. The sighting led a number of people to speculate about extraterrestrials and downed airplanes. A woman named Mariah told reporters that she had spotted the UFO passing over Princess Kahanu Estates. The 38-year-old says that she and her family witnessed the strange object and were so intrigued by it that they started following in their vehicle and watched it as it slowly dropped into the ocean. The sighting caught enough people's attention to get the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, involved and reports at ABC 11 News. Callers claim to have seen a large blue object fall from the sky into the ocean. The object was described to occasionally change shape, turning from a ball of light into the shape of a blue worm. The Federal Aviation Administration confirmed they had received several reports of the UFO from police officers who in turn had received calls from concerned residents. Officials with the FAA have confirmed that there were no aircraft incidents or accidents in the area at that time. Whatever this strange object was remains somewhat of a mystery. At around 9:25 Mountain Standard Time on May the 26, 1995, American West Flight 564 was cruising at 39,000 feet westbound over the Texas-New Mexico state line On the final leg of its flight from Dallas-Fort Worth into Las Vegas, Nevada, its ultimate destination, there were thunderstorms to the northeast as the Boeing 757, piloted by Captain Eugene Tollefson and First Officer John J. Waller, was passing near Bovina, Texas. The head flight attendant was watching the lightning flashes in the night sky when she noticed a line of regularly flashing lights in the sky to the north and below the airliner. The first officer then saw the lights as well, and they both witnessed a horizontal row of 8 strobe-like lights as bright as aircraft landing lights, flashing on and off in a sequence from left to right. The lights were at an altitude of between 30 and 35,000 feet and were bright white with a tinge of blue. Captain Tollefson then left his seat to look for himself and also saw a line of strange, regularly flashing lights. Then, as the lightning flashed behind the lights, it silhouetted something against the dark clouds that appeared to be a huge, dark, cigar-shaped object between 300 and 500 feet in length, depending on how far away it was. The mysterious object appeared to be below the 757. After about 5 minutes, Flight 564 continued its course as the lights began to fall behind. But shaken by what they had seen, the crew called Albuquerque FAA Air Route Traffic Control Center to report the incident. Albuquerque ATC noted that the position of the object was over a restricted military area at Taiban, and that the description sounded like a tethered aerostat moored balloon apart from the large number of strobes. The following is an excerpt from the transcription of the recording of the whole fascinating communication between the crew of the America West flight and the Albuquerque Air Route Traffic Control Center. Note: Cactus 564 is Flight 564. 9:29 p.m. AW 564. Cactus 564, off to our 3 o'clock. Got some strobes out there. Could you tell us what it is? ABQ. I'll tell you what. That's right now, I don't know what that is now. That is a restricted area that is used by the military out there during the daytime. AW 564. Yeah, it's pretty odd. ABQ. Hold on, let me see if anybody else knows around here. But after contacting various organizations to check for aerostats, whether balloons or any other military aircraft were in the air that night, the controller was given negative responses. The controller then contacted other aircraft in the area, but no one else could see the lights visible to the crew of Flight 564. Strangely, the controller at Albuquerque Air Route Traffic Control Center said that they had nothing at all on their radar, as the transcript of the conversation reveals. 9:30 p.m. AW 564. Cactus 564. Can you paint that object at all on your radar? ABQ. Cactus 564. No, I don't. And in talking to 3 or 4 guys around here, no one knows what that is. Never heard about that. AW 564. Cactus 564. Nobody's painting it at all? ABQ. Cactus 564. Say again. AW 564. I said there's nothing on their radars on the other centers at all on that garbled clear area. That object that's up in the air. ABQ. It's up in the air? AW 564. Affirmative. ABQ. No one knows anything about it. What's the attitude about? AW 564. I don't know. Probably right now around 30,000 or so. And there's a strobe that starts going on counterclockwise, and the length is unbelievable. 5 minutes later in the transmission, another aircraft breaks in on the conversation. The aircraft has not been identified, but at least one of the crew had obviously heard the previous discussion with Flight 564. You know, we're all up here huddled up talking about it. When it lightened, you could see the dark object. It was like a cigar shape from the altitude that we could see, and the length is what got us sort of confused because it looked like it was about 300 to 400 feet long. So I don't know if it's a wire with a strobe on it, but the strobe would start from the left and go to the right counterclockwise, and it was a pretty eerie looking sight, but had a strobe. Although the object was not visible on Albuquerque FAA radar, one of the controllers there contacted NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, who initially replied that they had nothing on their radar at that location. However, they called back later and said they did have an unidentified return in that area. Unfortunately, this return was later revealed to have been caused by a common small airplane with a malfunctioning transponder. The following day, the same controller checked again with NORAD, and this time he was told that they had indeed tracked another unknown target the previous night that was at first stationary, then accelerated and stopped again very rapidly. These quick bursts of speed were apparently recorded at somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 miles an hour. Such radar confirmation of the visual sighting made by Flight 564 would be of vital importance in the case, but unfortunately it has never been officially acknowledged by NORAD. This is perhaps not surprising. Would NORAD admit to tracking an unknown object in US airspace which had previously been described by a professional pilot as cigar-shaped and perhaps 500 feet long? In fact, the whole incident involving American West Flight 564 may not have seen the light of day at all if it hadn't been for the efforts of investigator Walter N. Webb of the UFO Research Coalition. After hearing whispers of Flight 564's encounter with a strange craft, Webb made a thorough investigation of the case, during which he was able to obtain copies of the FAA voice tapes of the conversation that we quoted between the plane's crew and the ground control operators. He also carried out interviews with the crew of the plane and air traffic controllers. One interesting and extremely relevant piece of information which Webb was able to obtain involved an F-117A stealth fighter from Holloman Air Force Base. Apparently, this plane was alerted to the report of the UFO made by Flight 564 and sent to investigate. The pilot radioed back that he had seen an object passing him on his left side and then quickly disappearing from view. This time the unknown was picked up on a radar as ground control confirmed. Again, however, this incident has never been officially acknowledged by NORAD. From the detailed information he received, Webb was able to make drawings of the UFO. He also filed Freedom of Information Act requests and records at various military installations to see if any activity on the night of May the 26th could account for the sighting. The result of his investigations was that there was nothing that could explain what the crew of America West Flight 564 had seen, and concluded that it must be classed as an unidentified craft of some kind. But there is a more mundane explanation for these sightings in the skies above the Texas-New Mexico state line. Dr. Michael DeRobertis, professor of astronomy at York University, Toronto, believes that bright object spotted by America West Flight 564 in 1995 was an unusually bright star. He stated that some of the brightest stars can give an illusion that they're strobing, that is, changing brightness really rapidly. As much as we respect our commercial and military pilots, part of their training does not include courses in astronomy and astrophysics. The sky is filled with a lot of apparitions and mystery. Not all of them are UFOs. American astronomer and author Seth Shostak supports this explanation. Shostak, who is currently the senior astronomy for the SETI Institute, has stated that it is relatively easy for trained pilots to be fooled by bright planets, especially if they're not paying too much attention to the night sky. Perhaps the pilot, after scanning his instruments inside the plane, suddenly turned to look from his instrument panel to outside the aircraft, was unable to adjust his eyesight quickly enough, and saw something completely normal like a planet and interpreted it as unusual. But surely a pilot who flies at night with thousands of hours in the air is used to seeing stars and celestial objects. He would surely have been trained to distinguish far-off stars and planets from relatively nearby flying objects inside the Earth's atmosphere. It also seemed logical to think that a pilot would not contact ground control about something unusual in the sky until they had confirmed what they saw. And what about the rest of the crew witnessing the object? It is extremely doubtful that anyone, never mind an experienced airline pilot and crew, could mistake a star or planet for a 500-long-foot cigar-shaped object with strobe lights, however unusually bright the celestial bodies may have been. Despite these weak attempts at an astronomical explanation for the case of America West 564, it remains a good example of a confirmed UFO by an experienced crew, with possible confirmation by radar. It has to be concluded that no satisfactory explanation has ever been found for what the crew of Flight 564 witnessed. Although the UFO phenomenon has been around for a long time, perhaps since the human race first emerged, it has had unique relationships with us, perhaps due to the way in which we perceive it. These objects seem to flit from place to place. Some people see them and some don't. Because of this, it's easy to see why skeptics and debunkers believe that they are nothing more than figments of our imagination. Nevertheless, there are others out there who are dedicated researchers and are equally convinced that this is not the case. Denial is the easy way out, since it precludes the need to actually look at the evidence, especially relating to what these strange flying craft actually look like and how we perceive them. The fact is that, remarkable as human vision is, in some respects, it's also painfully lacking in terms of range. The electromagnetic spectrum, and visible light is part of that spectrum, extends way beyond what human beings can see. What is accessible to us with our eyes alone extends in a very narrow band from the infrared to the ultraviolet, and beyond these parameters we see nothing because our eyes are not designed to see them. Perhaps this was based on how we evolved and we just didn't need vision that extended beyond these limits. Some animals have this ability, but again, this is evolutionary and they needed it to survive. It has been suggested that UFOs may use the parts of the EM spectrum that are unavailable to us and don't radiate or reflect electromagnetic radiation within the human band of vision. Perhaps this is deliberate on their part because it makes life easier for them and serves to conceal or cloak what they're doing. But alternatively, their eyes may have the inherent ability to see into the realms that are invisible to us. One researcher who noted the way in which UFO appear to travel was John A. Keel, who made the very valid point that these craft seem to appear at one end of the visible spectrum and display a reddish color when first seen, and when departing they frequently appear to be illuminated with a blue light. He speculated that the color shift was due to the craft perhaps slowing down to stop here on Earth, then speeding up again to depart. This is obviously not a proven fact, but it does seem to fit with what little we know of them. The unusual idea that UFO are not nuts and bolts objects, but are instead amoeba-like living entities, was first proposed by New Zealander Trevor James Constable, a former sailor who served 26 years as a radio officer in the US Merchant Navy. He discovered that occasionally anomalous objects appear in the sky, but he couldn't actually see them with the naked eye or capture images of them using a conventional camera. However, when he used a camera sensitive to ultraviolet light and equipped with high-speed film that could detect radiation beyond the top level of the visible spectrum, he obtained some remarkable results. When he processed the film, he noted some signs of discoloration that he interpreted as evidence of amoeba-like animals living in the sky. He speculated that these were in fact living creatures. He also coined the acronym IFMs, Invisible Flying Monsters, to describe what he claimed to have found. This was indeed a unique interpretation and completely different from the traditional view that UFOs were in fact structured craft of some kind that originated in other star systems. The view seems to have been corroborated several times by the people who claim to have been abducted by aliens and taken on board of these craft, which gave every indication of being machines of some kind. However, Constable's idea does seem to have some unlikely support, because a piece of NASA footage taken during a 1996 space shuttle flight shows pulsing, circular objects in the upper atmosphere that appear to have a beating heart inside of them. To be fair, at a pinch they do look like a kind of single-cell organism, and by way of corroboration, several UFOs have been reported that resemble snakes or worms. This suggests that these UFOs are organic in nature, and just perhaps life has evolved in a form that can exist in space. This is a view endorsed by two astronomers, Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickremana Singh, who said quite correctly that space is not an empty vacuum, but is full of life, or more correctly, the ingredients of life. It only requires the same sort of event that occurred here on Earth to combine them in the correct order for some kind of life to emerge. If evidence for the existence of these bizarre space amoebas may have inadvertently and repeatedly been obtained by NASA, but for obvious reasons this has been suppressed. This phenomenon is very familiar to the controversy caused by the appearance in the mid-1990s of the so-called rods that first appeared on photographic film. These enigmatic rods were first brought to the attention of the public by the filmmaker Jose Escamilla. They are sometimes known as skyfish or solar entities and became part of the esoteric field of cryptozoology. They were said to be living creatures that moved through the air at such a high speed that they were invisible to the naked eye. Although they gave the appearance of being living, winged entities, they were probably photographic artifacts caused by the way in which the shutters on film cameras operate. However, this may not be true of the airborne amoeba seen by James Constable. Although he died in 2016, his work sparked the interest of a British researcher named Nick Hayes, whose interest in UFOs and ufology began with his own Christmas 2008 sightings. This involved seeing an oval-shaped, multicolored object that passed above him, and from his perspective, it seemed to be entirely made of light. Unfortunately, he was the only witness, but this may be due to the recognized fact that UFOs can be very selective about who sees them. Having become interested in the phenomena described by Constable, Hayes bought his own equipment and began looking for invisible UFOs in the skies above his back garden. The equipment was not at all that expensive, because a normal camcorder can be converted to detect infrared and ultraviolet radiation using a suitable filter placed over the lens. Using a similar technique to those used to detect rods, Hayes pointed his camera at a patch of sky, records, then at a later date analyzes the footage. Since the recordings can last for hours, this is a time-consuming process because he has to go through the recordings frame by frame. However, apart from his search for the sky amoebas, he also claims to have captured UFOs using the unlikely method of a Geiger counter. He activates the Geiger counter and points at a location, and when he gets a higher reading on it, he points his video camera in that direction. The increased reading, according to Hayes, is due to the fact that the phenomenon is emanating a high level of ionizing radiation than the background, and ionizing radiation is what a Geiger counter detects. It is suspected that at least some UFOs emit high levels of radiation, as was seen with both the Cash Landrum incident, where the occupants of a car who saw the UFO displayed what were diagnosed as radiation burns. Something similar was also seen during the famous Rendlesham Forest incident, when high levels of ionizing radiation were detected at the supposed landing site. Hayes has captured hundreds of images of fast-moving objects that are not visible in normal light, but are when filters are applied. Unfortunately, due to the lack of reference points, it's almost impossible to determine the size of these objects or how far away they are, which often happens when filming something in the sky. However, some of the objects seem to be in front of the trees in his garden, and this helps provide a reference point, but it only indicates that the UFOs, if that's what they are very small. This is something that was also found with the images of the rods. There are pitfalls involved in this kind of study, because digital camcorders can produce anomalous images caused by recording small flying objects, like flies and moths and so on, in a way that makes them hard to identify. This is what eventually cast doubt on the larger so-called rods captured by Jose Escamilla and others. Because the way the camcorder shutter works, it creates motion blur and can show flying insects as long, rod-like objects with multiple wing-like appendages sticking out from the body at right angles. In fact, these appendages were really insect wings, and the camera frame rate was too slow to catch the insect as a single object as it flew by. However, Nick Hayes learned from his mistakes and took steps to avoid them. He deliberately made a number of recordings of insects to produce the rod effect and compared them to the UFO images he had obtained. He noticed that they were quite different. One of the best images Hayes obtained showed an object with a cylindrical, silvery metallic body with a row of metallic rods emerging from one end. The object was surrounded by a halo or cloud of mist with a wedge-shaped gap on one side. There were two frames in which the object, which, although quite small, appeared to be a technological device of some kind, was visible as it seemed to travel past the eaves of his house. Interestingly, it only appeared when using the ultraviolet filter. In a strange resonance with the famous Skull experiment, which was intended to provide incontrovertible proof of communication with the departed, 2 teenagers living close to Hayes reported seeing small disc-shaped objects of less than a foot in diameter outside their home. Something very similar was seen in the cellar where the majority of Skull experiments were conducted. It was reported by those who attended the sessions that small spacecraft only 2 or 3 inches in length occasionally appeared, sometimes with what looked like flames coming out of one end. On other occasions, they were circular and about 3 inches across. They also glowed and illuminated the cellar with faint light and sometimes landed on the outstretched palms of the sitters. On one occasion, during an experiment using unexposed 35mm film, the image of an entity that the Skull team dubbed Blue appeared on the film. The reason for the choice of name was due to the color of the image, but the entity Blue was identical to a grey. Haynes has created various categories to describe the various objects he has recorded, and he calls them mushrooms, skyfish, and jellyfish. Hayes is also interested in the theories developed by the late American psychologist and inventor Wilhelm Reich, who created the term orgone energy to describe a kind of usable natural force that surrounds us. Because of this, he recreated a so-called cloudbuster, a kind of rain-making weather modification machine invented by Reich. This device used orgone energy to function. Unfortunately, because Reich made certain medical claims for orgone energy and they threatened the stranglehold of the American Medical Association, they relentlessly pursued him in the courts and he ended up in jail, but the same fate has not befallen Hayes. Reich also says he observed UFOs several times when his machine was running, and Hayes claims he has had similar results when using his version of the device. The question is, what to make of it? Are there really small extraterrestrial flying machines traveling at will around our planet, cloaked in the parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that we cannot see? Or are large amoeba-like creatures also cruising around in our upper atmosphere, again, more or less at will? The answer is that it's only through people like Nick Hayes, who are willing to ask the question and carry out the investigations, that we are ever likely to find out. Hopefully, his researchers will eventually bear fruit, and we will discover the truth.
There are 2 types of lizard or reptilian kind of beings. When they appear on Earth, they try to do it covertly. Some come from a total different reality, others come from different planets. They all have their own agenda.
When we had EBA 1 in captivity from 1947, 1952, one of the big questions was, do you have a soul? EBA 1 said, absolutely I have a soul. It is eternal.
There are phenomena going on. We also have different life forms, and the Pentagon reports acknowledge that. So when Earth enters a full harmonious level 4 consciousness, those things will appear and they will affect everyone. And we can see that there are some forces on this planet, extraterrestrial forces, that try to ascend humanity faster.
UFO reports about near-air collisions with aircraft are quite common. Such incidents are well documented. Examples include the January 1995 Manchester International Airport near miss and UFOs seen in very close proximity to civilian aircraft, like the Japan Airlines Flight 1628 incident. In total, there are thousands of such reported incidents worldwide. But how often is it reported that UFOs are interested in trains? Well, more than we suppose. On a cold Kentucky night on January the 14th, 2002, a CSX train carrying 16,000 tons of coal from Russell to Shelbyana in Kentucky had a most unusual encounter. As the train passed milepost 42, which runs parallel with the Big Sandy River, something caught the eye of the conductor. Looking into the darkness ahead, he saw bright lights. Promptly, he alerted the driver, who flashed the train lights and sounded the warning horn. But there was no response from the other vehicle, and just as the driver was about to sound the horn again, the diesel engines died. As the driver frantically checked his instrument panel, the proximity alarm activated. Something was most definitely out there ahead of them. Every member of the crew saw a number of bright objects hovering over the tracks and the nearby river. But contrary to their first thoughts, this wasn't another train on the track. They were metallic-looking objects with multiple lights on them, a row on the bottom and several on the middle section of the disc-like craft. Then suddenly, a bright light shone in the face of the conductor. He looked again and noticed that these strange objects didn't seem to have any windows and were about 20 feet in length and 10 feet in height. They were UFOs. When he noticed that one of the UFOs was just above the tracks and that the train was moving quickly towards it, he and the train crew began to panic. The train's emergency braking system had immediately engaged on the loss of power, but a collision was imminent. The crew braced for impact. A few seconds later, the front of the train struck one of the UFOs. There was a tremendous crashing sound, which knocked the crew to the floor. The object had apparently clipped the front engine, bounced and smashed a piece from it before hitting two of the coal wagons. The crew watched in amazement as the object sped off into the night sky. Eventually, the train came to a standstill, and immediately the engines burst into life again. The train crew contacted the dispatcher in Jacksonville ahead and reported the strange and alarming incident. But as soon as the train reached Jacksonville, the crew were taken to an office and questioned by some unknown men dressed in dark suits. They wanted to know what exactly had happened, what they had seen, and where the objects went after the collision. As this interrogation was in progress, engineers checked over the damaged locomotive and instructed the crew to drive it to the rail yard at Paintsville. Word has it that the damaged parts of the train and engines were removed and taken to some unknown destination. It's been speculated that the UFOs were initially over the nearby Big Sandy River collecting water, an activity noted before in UFO sightings. Well, 14 years on, several researchers have questioned the authenticity of this case. They note that the official report by the International Union of Wagon Keepers stated that the damage to the locomotive was caused by a rock slide in one of the many train tunnels that are scattered around that mountainous region. Though the photograph of the locomotive does seem to show damage, the skeptical researchers question whether it was actually the same locomotive. Unfortunately, like many alleged UFO incidents, true facts often get mixed with false information, speculation and rumours. There are even rumours that the train had been taken to a secret location where National Security Agency specialists investigated the damage and checked for radiation. But in fairness, there is no evidence of this. However, if the photograph is genuine, then damage is clearly visible, and it does match up with their stories. It's not the first time that UFOs have been reported in close proximity to trains. A Monon Railroad train crew also reported seeing UFOs in north-central Indiana on October the 8th, 1958. There were 3 crewmen in the diesel locomotive cab: driver Harry Ekman, fireman Cecil Bridge, and Morris Ott, who was the head brakeman. Meanwhile, Paul Sosby, the flagman, and the conductor, Ed Robinson, were situated in the caboose at the rear. As the train passed Wasco Crossroads, the crew suddenly caught sight of 4 unusual lights in the sky moving slowly towards them in an open V formation. Suddenly, the lights rushed towards the front of the train and then come back again, now travelling towards the east. At this point, realising that they were watching something truly unusual, one of them grabbed the radio and alerted the 2 other crewmen in the caboose. Some minutes later, the objects came speeding back and flew directly over the train, thus allowing the conductor and the flagman to get a closer look. The objects were round or circular in shape, approximately 40 feet in diameter and about 10 feet in height. Each was fuzzy around the edges and glowing, though strangely the lights didn't seem to light up anything on the ground as they passed over. Thinking that they'd gone for good, the crew relaxed a little. To their alarm, the objects reappeared and came rushing up the tracks behind them, this time a lot faster, but no longer in formation. The crew decided to wave their flashlights to see what would happen. They noticed that the objects jumped sideways, out of the way of the beams. It would seem that this action was interpreted by the alien pilots as an invitation to come closer. Once again, the crew shone their flashlights, which on this occasion caused them to scatter. As the train switched lines at Frankfurt, the objects stayed far back up the tracks, just hovering there until the train moved off. Then they continued to follow a little longer, and suddenly they shot off to the northeast and kept going until they were fully out of sight. No one has ever offered an explanation for the event. On October the 20th, 1973, at 6:50 a.m., near Mount Vernon and Evansville, Indiana, the crew of an L&N loco had witnessed an unidentified object in the sky near St. Philip's, which was 8 miles east of Evansville. Their experience started with engine trouble near Upton, a small town on the outskirts of Mount Vernon. As they pulled the 3,000-ton load, they noticed that one of the rear diesel engines was overheating. They were forced to stop at Upton so that an engineer could look over the engine. He informed the crew that it was dead. The crew struggled on with one engine and arrived at Mount Vernon about 25 minutes later than usual. A short time later, despite the engine problems, 2 of the crewmen in the front engine cab saw a very bright, distant object in the sky coming towards them from the north. As they watched, they first thought it was an aircraft, but due to the lack of aircraft recognition lighting, they began to think that it was something quite unusual, particularly as the object glowed with a pulsating, bright white light. They were now passing St. Philip's and heading uphill towards Belknap at Peerless Crossing. The train was clearly struggling to ascend the hill due to having only one functioning engine and had slowed down considerably. The conductor suggested that they should contact the train behind them, which had been following them for several miles, to see if it could help shunt them up the hill. So the crew radioed the tower at Howell Roundhouse in Evansville to see if the train behind them could be identified and contacted. The yardmaster in Evansville informed them that there were no trains behind them. By this time, they'd ground to a halt. The conductor instructed the crew to reboard the train and reverse it down the hill. Once they'd reached the bottom, they stopped. He decided to press the start button on the rear engine, and, to his surprise, the unit started immediately and seemed to be running well. How could this be? The engineer back in Upton had informed them that the engine was dead. As he turned to walk back, he glanced over his shoulder and noticed that the bright light in the distance had moved farther back. The warning signals by the side of the track were now showing the colour green, when earlier they were showing red, indicating another train on the track. This was very strange. Could it be that whatever this bright light was, it was generating enough electric field to cause the blocking system to interpret it as another train? No explanation was ever found as to what the crew had seen in the sky and on the tracks behind them. Well, what are we to make of these stories? Usually, when looking closely at accounts of UFO sightings, ET activity and paranormal events, one can find arguments on both sides, evidence that back them up, and evidence that cast doubt on their veracity. Strangely, with these train-related events, no rational rebuttals are forthcoming, and we are left with the very real possibility that these truly were UFOs. For it's not unreasonable to trust the observations of such train crew who, for obvious safety reasons, are both skilled and experienced in making accurate observations. Perhaps UFOs are just curious about vehicles that to them must seem utterly primitive, as steam trains may seem to today's younger generation.
Our modern world has become completely reliant on electricity. It connects and powers our machines. All you have to do is walk down the street and you can see how dependent the human race has become on technology. High voltages are extremely dangerous and vulnerable to mechanical failure. Over the years, the US have experienced massive power blackouts, affecting millions of people and throwing their lives into sudden chaos. But some experts believe power grids are not failing due to human error. They're being sabotaged by an extraterrestrial threat. In Argentina in November 2009, hundreds of people were out weathering a hot night in the town of Yocanvi Gonzales. Suddenly the sky began to glow, and hundreds watched in terror as a strange, gigantic, luminous ship moved towards the hydroelectric power station on the Uramento River. The object hovered for several minutes and then disappeared, but not before over 1 million people were plunged into total darkness. Did a single UFO cause a blackout of over 100 square miles? If extraterrestrials are really showing up, we have to ask why. Obviously, this isn't a show of force. Their technology must be far advanced from ours. The answer may be found decades earlier in the events that took place on US soil. In Levelland, Texas on November 2, 1957, dozens of witnesses reported strange lights in the sky hovering for over 3 hours. A signed statement by Levelland patrolman gives terrifying details about the incident. "I saw a strange-looking flash which looked to be down the roadway. The flash went from east to west and appeared to be close to the ground. As the lights descend to a busy stretch of roadway, 10 vehicles are stopped dead in their tracks. Residents all over town report power being drained from their car engines. When the lights in the sky disappear, the vehicles start and continue on their way undamaged." America's top-secret UFO unit, Project Blue Book, immediately investigates the incident. They determined UFOs may be using a type of electromagnetic interference. Edward Ruppelt, former chief of Project Blue Book, admits, "We had reports of radiation and induction fields in connection with UFOs." The 1957 wave of electromagnetic cases presents, quote, "a whole new dimension to UFO investigation. Could this alien electromagnetic phenomena be used to disable more than car batteries and headlights?" Following the Second World War, the installation of massive power grids allowed America to triple its energy consumption. Could this sudden leap in energy usage be attracting alien attention? Exeter in New Hampshire is a small, picturesque New England town. But in 1965, the quiet atmosphere was shattered one afternoon as multiple witnesses reported a series of glowing orbs descending from the skies and tapping directly into the power lines. Local police arrived on the scene as an Air Force bomber appears in the sky. The UFOs quickly fly off with the plane in pursuit. On November 9th, 1965, a mother and her children observe a fireball streaking across the sky over Syracuse, New York. As it passes, the lights in their home flicker ominously. The largest blackout the continent has ever seen descends on North America. The Great Northeastern Blackout plunged 30 million people across 2 countries into total darkness. 8 eastern US states and much of southern Canada were left without electricity. At Syracuse Airport, New York, planes beginning their descent are met by a pitch-black runway. Within 1 minute of the blackout, passengers and the deputy aviation commander at the Syracuse airport witness a massive 150-foot fiery disk moving across the sky. As the airport plunges into darkness, a flight instructor and his student began their descent towards the tarmac. While preparing for landing, they witnessed another strange glowing light over the nearby Clay substation. Then at 5:27 p.m., power ceases for approximately 25 million people. New York City rush hour descends into chaos. Loaded elevators stop in the shafts, and 800,000 commuters are stranded in subway tunnels. Above ground, stoplights fail, traffic jams extend miles in every direction, and hundreds of thousands of people rush into the dark streets. A bright light in the sky appears above the darkened city. It's the same UFO witnessed at the Clay substation, or is it a second mysterious craft draining New York City of every kilowatt of power? When the New York Power Authorities dispatches a team to the Clay substation, they are allegedly met by FBI agents. But while looting and fires grip the city, the Power's Authority investigation finds nothing out of the ordinary, and power is restored 13 hours later. The FBI refuses to comment or even acknowledge their involvement. Over the ensuing weeks, a media frenzy speculates that an alien craft is the cause of the blackout. Life magazine, one of the most respected magazines ever published, runs a photo with the caption, "Could this be a UFO?" But it isn't until 3 years later that the possibility of alien interference is investigated. The US government House Committee on Science and Astronauts holds a special session. A leaked memo is discovered that rips the Condon investigation apart. Accusations emerge of a government cover-up. In the memo, one lead researcher referred to the search for extraterrestrials as nonsense. NICAP immediately withdraws its involvement, claiming the investigation is a sham and no real results were ever intended. In the face of mounting evidence and hundreds of eyewitness accounts, the Condon report still states, "Nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified." On the heels of the Condon report, the US government suddenly ceases all investigations into the UFO phenomenon. The Air Force officially closes Project Blue Book on December 17, 1969. James McDonald addresses the media before the report's release and claims the investigations were designed to fail. A newspaper article of the day states he repeated the accusation that the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, had ordered the Air Force to debunk UFO reports. So that was really a policy that was implemented back in 1953 through the CIA, and essentially that continues to this very day, where most scientists and most people who occupy senior positions in the bureaucracy or in the media or any position of influence, if they talk about this topic, they will be very easily ridiculed. It appears the US government would go to any lengths to control information about the UFO presence. By 1977, tensions over economic concerns and a North American energy crisis have the population on edge. President Carter informs the American people the energy crisis is a clear and present danger to our nation. But is Carter referring to the Middle East oil crisis or an alien threat? On July the 12th, 1977, New York State, the city that never sleeps, is strangely quiet. While driving home, a family witnesses two unidentified craft descending on the nuclear power plant at Indian Point. The highway is soon filled with parked cars and onlookers watching in awe as the glowing crafts hover over the plant. Reportedly, they are eerily silent. Are they monitoring the Indian Point nuclear facility? There are UFO cases where they would appear and actually shut down the nuclear facility, sometimes for minutes on end. They would have had an actual physical effect on the base. The very next day, just 30 miles south of Indian Point nuclear power plant, New York City is hit with another devastating blackout. Hundreds of stores and homes are looted. Rampant arson destroys entire neighborhoods. 35 blocks of Broadway alone are destroyed. Police and firemen struggle to maintain some kind of order, but the city is in a state of total chaos. Over 55 police officers are injured and over 4,500 people are arrested. In the morning, as the sun begins to rise, several fires still rage across the city. The New York City mayor told the press, "The blackout has threatened our safety and has seriously impacted our economy. We have been needlessly subjected to a night of terror in many communities that have been looted and burned." New York City will eventually be rebuilt and will recover, but in the decade to come, mankind would find new ways to feed its thirst for power and technology. Did our escalating reliance on power make us even more vulnerable to alien interference? UFO sightings over nuclear facilities are still occurring all around the world. Why are the UFOs attracted to nuclear power? Is it merely a convenient source of fuel? If so, the greater question is, what would happen if our nuclear output fails to meet their increasing needs?
Why would UFOs hover for a long time over nuclear power reactors and military sites? What are they doing? Making observations? Collecting data? Assessing our technology? Whatever the reason, it has caused the most intense interest from governments and ufologists over the years. At 12:34 a.m. on September the 19th, 1976, reports from concerned citizens started to reach the Cherokee Air Force Base regarding unusual lights seen over the city of Tehran. Witnesses reported a brilliant white light darting back and forth above them. One witness reported it was like a helicopter with a searchlight scanning the ground. The reported sightings were passed up the chain of command and reached General Yousefi, the Deputy Commander of Operations. Yousefi wasn't initially concerned and said that the sightings were nothing more than stars. However, he decided to communicate with the Mehrabad International Airport Control Tower, who also reported unusual aerial activity. In light of this, Yousefi decided to take a look for himself, and from his observations was now a little less sure that the incident was simply the vivid imaginations of the general public. Looking up, he could clearly see an object moving of its own accord and under obvious intelligent control. And furthermore, it was, as he said, much larger and brighter than any star he had ever seen. General Yousefi ordered the scrambling of an F-4 Phantom II jet fighter. By 1:30 a.m., the pilot, Captain Mohammad Reza Azizkhani, was speeding through the night skies over Tehran in his F-4. Within a minute, the pilot was about 73 miles off the location, but could already see the object in front of him. The brilliance of its light was incredible. He continued towards it, intent on carrying out his orders and making an interception, with missiles, if necessary. However, when Captain Azizkhani was just 25 miles away, all the aircraft's communications, guidance controls and defence instruments failed. Azizkhani was forced to retreat and not engage, as each time he got closer to the object, another fault would appear. Following Azizkhani's forced return, at about 1:40 a.m, Yousefi gave orders to scramble another F-4, piloted by Lieutenants Parviz Jafari and Jalal Demirian. Travelling through the air at over 170 miles an hour, they soon had the object within their sight. It was the size of a Boeing 707 plane. When they got to within 30 miles of it, however, it began to move. As both the F-4 and the UFO moved through the sky, the distance separating them was maintained at all times, as if the object was pacing their speeds. On the perimeter of the UFO there was an array of flashing lights, which changed from green to blue, then to red, and then to orange before completing the cycle again. The pilots tried to close the gap between themselves and the object. Then suddenly, without warning, a second object detached itself from the main unknown craft and headed directly towards them at great speed. Thinking they were under attack, Jafari instinctively launched one of the Sidewinder missiles. As he pressed his fire button, he noticed that nothing happened. Everything was offline. Fearful of being destroyed, they decided to eject from the aircraft, but even the ejector seats failed to work. Jafari turned the jet away from the pursuing object, and as he looked over his shoulder, he noticed that the small pursuing object had retreated back to the main craft. And with that, the jet's instruments sparked back to life. As the pilots maintained their course, they could see the object to their far left. Then they witnessed another secondary object leave the main craft and approach them at great speed, leading the pilots to suspect it was some sort of missile. Unexpectedly, the secondary craft descended quickly and came to a rest hovering just above the ground. According to the two pilots, a 2-mile radius was illuminated by the immense glow of the craft. Incidentally, a witness on the ground corroborated their account. The pilots turned and flew their aircraft over the landing site, close to the Ray oil refinery on the outskirts of Iran, noting that each time they passed over the object, they experienced interference with their communications. Jafari eventually headed back towards Mehrabad Airport. As they approached the airport runway, a cylinder-shaped craft suddenly came into view, with lights at each end and a flashing light in the middle. It continued to pace them for a short time overhead, eventually disappearing as the F-4 came to a stop on the runway. Again, the aircraft's navigation equipment experienced similar interference. Furthermore, both pilots were struggling with their vision after staring into the intensely bright lights of the otherworldly vehicles, and hoped that their retinas had not been damaged. The pilots of a civilian aircraft, also landing at Mehrabad Airport, reported similar sightings, and their communications had gone temporarily offline when the craft was near them. Daylight came, and a search team was dispatched to the suspected landing site of the detached craft. Although they could find no evidence of the craft having landed, they did pick up a beeping in the vicinity. It's worth noting that a beeping sound was also reported by Betty and Barney Hill during their early and famous close encounter experience in September of 1961. A little over 18 months later, in April 1978, a similar sighting was seen near the capital. A private pilot, along with his co-pilot, witnessed a glittering object while flying from Ahvaz to Tehran. The pilot managed to obtain photographs of the object, but they were confiscated by the civil aviation authorities. Perhaps even more startling was the information volunteered by Mehrabad Airport. According to their data, the object that was close to the ground was over 20 times the size of a jumbo jet. Of course, the 18-month period that followed, the Iranian uprising and the abdication of the Shah, led Iran to a more insular position on the world stage. Part of that would mean our having limited access to such otherworldly events as UFO sightings over Iran. However, in the July 18, 1978 edition of the Tehran Journal, multiple witnesses in the northern part of the city reported that a strange-looking object had suddenly emerged in the sky and hovered there silently. The journal reported that it had begun to move slowly towards the southwest, glowing as it did. Like the 1976 incident, radar operators at Mehrabad Airport would, yet again, confirm the sighting on their instruments. In addition, an airborne Lufthansa plane also registered the anomaly on its radar equipment. The sightings over Iran have apparently continued since, even if information about them is now rather limited. In 1994, the Sightings TV programme tracked down and interviewed various people involved in the incident. Nearly all expressed the opinion that they were dealing with a high-tech extraterrestrial craft. Lieutenant Jafari, the pilot of the first interceptor, estimated that the UFO was travelling somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 miles an hour. He said,
"The object was beyond my speed and power. The second F-4 interceptor also could not catch it up. That's when I thought, this is a UFO."
Then he added,
"No country owns this type of craft, so I was thinking it has to be from another planet."
At a Washington, D.C. press conference on November 12, 2007, Jafari added that the main craft actually admitted 4 objects, one that had headed towards him and later returned to the main craft, one that he had tried to fire on, another which followed them back, and one, glowing intensely, which appeared to have landed on the desert floor. Following his prepared statement at the press conference, Jafari was asked if he believed that he had encountered an alien spacecraft, and he replied that he was certain that he had. In 2014, a magazine known as Air Forces Monthly managed to secure an Iranian report concerning the UFO activities over several of their strategic facilities in 2004 and 2005. Furthermore, the report spoke of dogfights between their military fighter jets and these unknown objects. Other reports state that the pilots of the F-4 Phantoms and the F-14A Tomcat jets came up against luminescent UFOs over Kondab and Bushehr. One particular incident on the 28th of October 2004 stands out. A glowing UFO was seen hovering over the heavy water reactor near the Arank facility in Kondab. The report stated that the craft appeared to be gathering data from the reactor. When military aircraft approached the object in question, it disappeared, only to reappear within seconds several miles away. This went on for quite a while. The pilots involved in the incident said that, based on the manoeuvres of the vehicle and the incredible speeds with which it performed them, the vehicle was nothing like any man-made object they had ever seen. Perhaps it is worth noting the results of a 2009 report by the Iranian Air Force Strategic Research and Studies. They suggested that UFOs were, in fact, man-made. Furthermore, they said the vast majority of sightings over the past 3 decades appeared to be near to sites connected to Iran's nuclear programs and ballistic missile sites. You may remember that Iranian intelligence suggested that key coalition targets in the 2 Gulf Wars often experienced UFO sightings before their destruction. In fact, even during the televised accounts of Operation Desert Storm, reporters from well-known US news channels also made reference to odd-looking lights stationary in the sky, as if simply watching our war efforts unfold, much like the days of the mysterious Foo Fighter UFOs of the Second World War. In the summer of 2017, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani spoke publicly of a UFO encounter that he'd experienced as a young boy in the mid-1950s. While it was only his personal account and not a release of classified information, it was still an admission not often seen from someone in such a position. Also, in Rouhani's case, he's very much of an academic, a lawyer, and of obvious sound mind. Several months earlier, in January 2017, footage and reports began to circulate online of the Iranian military firing upon a UFO from attack positions on the ground in Tehran. According to the main witness, the incident occurred on the 17th of January at about 5 p.m. Thousands of people saw events unfold as they looked on from Enqilab Square in the capital city. As well as the bizarre objects, between 6 and 10 in total, military jets also made several passes overhead. These jets would continue to patrol the skies for several minutes, seemingly searching for the objects, but to no avail. The authorities later stated that the objects were simply unmanned aerial vehicles, essentially drones. However, witnesses did not agree and went on to state that Iranian soldiers positioned themselves on top of tall buildings in attack formations. The fact that this was done in full view of the public showed that it was a very serious incident. And as for the objects being drones, it was simply a cover. It seems that the UFOs continue to evade aircraft interceptions and go about their agenda collecting data from many sensitive facilities, be they nuclear facilities or military establishments. It's interesting to look at the official refutations of this incident. Well-known UFO skeptic and journalist Philip Julian Klaas, nicknamed the Sherlock Holmes of ufology, disputes the analyses of the pilot's experiences. He thinks that the pilots saw Jupiter in the sky and that their incompetence with radar had led to the misunderstanding. He claims that a Westinghouse engineer at Cherokee Base stated that the aircraft was known to have intermittent electrical outages and had only just returned from being fixed again. Investigative author Brian Dunning notes that on the 19th of September, when the incident occurred, very heavy meteorite showers were at their height, and that falling objects and lights would therefore occur naturally without the need of extraterrestrial explanations. However, there is no doubt that Jafari's account, and those of others, has been taken seriously at very high levels. In 2007, Jafari recounted his extremely detailed and remarkable story in front of very high-ranked officials and military personnel at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The Tehran incident garnered a lot of excitement both in the Middle East and clearly in the United States as well. Indeed, a detailed 4-page report was prepared by the US Defense Intelligence Agency and was distributed to no less than the White House, the NSA, and the CIA. Whatever happened in the skies that day in Tehran was a dogfight of perhaps interplanetary proportions. It was one of the few cases that stretched national borders and remains one of the most well-documented and perhaps most worrying threats to the security of our skies.
August 1970, 3 a.m. Taknimi Azir and his brother were sitting in the front compartment of their family's camper motorhome when several of their travelling companions were stood outside, stretching their legs under the starry night sky of Yuma, Arizona. Beneath the full moon, a serene patchwork of fields stretched out towards the distant Yuma City skyline. Taknimi was taking in the view when he noticed a string of blue lights in the distance, running parallel to the ground, around 20 in total. Perhaps they were from nearby landing strips of some kind. He wondered, however, despite the curious blue lights giving the impressions of a runway, he knew there was nothing of the sort around for miles, certainly not an airport, not even a small private one. Still wrestling with the question of why a landing strip would be in the middle of nowhere with no surrounding support buildings, Taknimi turned around to ask for some food from a family member in the back of his motorhome. Upon turning back, however, he could now see a horizontal line of blue lights heading straight towards their vehicle. As he was trying to rationalize what could possibly be flying so low to the ground, he realized that the object was making no noise whatsoever. Furthermore, it was flying painfully slowly over the field, almost as if it were gliding. Still sat in the motorhome, he and his brother would watch the craft for around 15 minutes before winding down the windows of their vehicle to better detect any possible engine noise from the object, but it remained absolutely silent. Especially troubling for the brothers was that even the ambient noise of the countryside had now fallen eerily silent. No insects, no breeze, nothing. This effect is characteristic of what is known in ufology as the Oz factor, which ufologist Jenny Randles has described as a sensation of being isolated or transported from the real world into a different environmental framework when in close proximity to a UFO. Taknimi noted that the object was moving incredibly slowly. It had still not reached the motorhome. At times he felt certain the object was standing still and not moving at all. As the minutes passed, the object eventually reached 2 oak trees in the distance before slowly ascending skyward. As it did so, another object with an identical set of lights appeared directly underneath it, following the exact same trajectory. Taknimi would later state how it appeared as though this second craft had been waiting on the ground or even appeared from under the ground itself. As Taknimi sat watching the bizarre scene unfold, his brother suggested that they shine the camper's spotlight towards one of the aircraft. Sensing that this might not be a good idea, Taknimi urged his brother not to do so. The two craft then began to rise and hover for several minutes before returning to a lower position. It appeared almost as if they were putting on some kind of demonstration as they maneuvered around each other in the sky, giving the appearance of boats rocking on deep water. Taknimi would later recall they seemed aware of each other's slightest movement, like they were alive. The first object was now directly over the second one, and both of the witnesses were watching as the first object suddenly dropped towards and crashed into the second one. However, instead of an explosion of sound and fire, the two objects simply bounced off each other in total silence. Each of the objects would then continue their slow climb from the ground upwards. As the two strange objects came into the full light of the moon, it became immediately apparent that the planes were not planes at all. What's more, the objects were now almost on top of the motorhome. The two witnesses could see the objects had no wings and were in fact distinctly circular, like two pie pans put together. Confronted with the impossible sight, the two witnesses screamed out loud, capturing the attention not only of their party in the motorhome, but also of the strange craft, which now shot suddenly towards them, coming to a dead stop almost directly above their heads, no higher than the top of the telegraph poles that lined the road. As the witnesses looked up, they could see the full underside of the ships hovering above them. Taknimi recalled how they appeared as light as the air itself. Despite clearly being solid metal objects, they had a nickel-colored dull smooth steel finish with no windows, doors or seams. It seemed as though the objects were going to land directly on top of the motorhome, leading to several more panic screams from the rest of the group, who were now also watching the events unfold. They would estimate the circular objects were at least 3 times the size of their vehicle. Then, as cries of panic rang out across the night, the objects stopped. Taknimi and around 10 other witnesses were watching now. Taknimi would recall, flying side by side, the two saucers went up on their sides from a horizontal to a vertical position in perfect synchronization, and now stood in the sky a stone's throw above us, like 2 huge pewter silver wheels. Then, right in front of the awestruck spectators, the two wheels began to slowly glow with intensely bright light, which somehow seemed to stretch out and meet in between them. Within seconds, this light revealed a bizarre mechanical metamorphosis from dull flat sources into huge glowing orbs. Strangely, there was no sound, no smell of smoke, and no heat, despite the witnesses being only a matter of feet away. The next thing the onlookers realized, the two orbs had shot off like white-hot meteors, only they were moving upwards and in the direction of the Yuma skyline. Within a minute, the two objects appeared like bouncing stars over the buildings of the downtown area. As the now much relieved but still unnerved witnesses watched the display, the orbs changed colors from blue to white to red and then to green. As they watched the strange lights dance above the skyline of the city, suddenly the objects headed back in their direction, sending the terrified witnesses scrambling back into the motorhome. Taknimi would recall, our vehicle raised a cloud of dust so thick we could barely see through it. Looking out of our windows and up, we could see the objects were back and following us from the sky. Now, however, the objects were no longer hovering at low altitude, but they were as high as any commercial plane. In fact, they looked just like planes, until they stopped suddenly and changed direction in complete synchronization. As the witnesses focused on the objects, it also became apparent that they had changed their form from orbs back to saucers. The pursuit would continue until they reached the immediate outskirts of the city limits, where they felt safe enough to pull over to the side of the road. They watched now as the two glowing objects moved back in the direction they had come from and vanished into the night sky. The rest of the vacation continued without incident, and none of the witnesses would ever again see anything even vaguely resembling what had pursued them that terrifying night. But the impact of the event was such that all of them would watch the skies for the rest of their lives. It should be noted that the case of the morphing saucers, as described here, has striking parallels with another dramatic UFO encounter that happened 4 years later. The incident, as documented by Spanish ufologist Juan José Benítez, occurred late at night in the Spanish municipality of Jerez de la Frontera in 1974. In July of that year, a 24-year-old witness was riding his motorbike through the region while visiting his girlfriend when he spotted a peculiar dull orb of light descending over a hill approximately a mile from his location on the highway. Instantly captivated by this strange sight, the brave motorcyclist decided to set course for distant orbs in hope of finding where they may have landed. What ensued was an otherworldly game of cat and mouse, which saw the mysterious orb simply vanish each time the biker approached to within a few hundred feet of it. First it was ahead of him, then it was behind him, but the witness was determined, and eventually he got close enough to see the orb was in fact a circular craft of some kind topped with an opaque glass dome. Again, the object simply vanished from view, and it was then he noticed the exact same sensation as described by the witness in our previous case from Yuma, Arizona. The whole area seemed to have been enveloped by an eerie blanket of silence and stillness, as heavy as lead. As the witness continued down the highway, he could see what looked like a truck with bright lights traveling along the road not too far ahead of him at approximately 30 miles per hour. He caught up with it easily enough but kept a safe distance. He realized that then the truck was completely silent. As it rounded a bend ahead of him, it simply vanished into thin air. But the game was far from over. Now ahead of him and low to the ground, the domed craft appeared once more before instantly and indistinguishably transforming into what looked like two cars side by side, their headlights shining brightly in his direction. More curious than ever, the witness felt compelled to rev his motorbike and head straight towards the cars. He would go on to describe a surreal encounter with the occupants of one of the vehicles, which looked like highly polished grey sedans and which seemed somehow not quite right. The driver and passengers were also unusual somehow, and he had the distinct impression that they were expecting him. Completely human in appearance, athletic and smartly dressed, the three men in the vehicle closest to him wore grey suits, while the attire of the attractive blonde woman in the back seat was not discernible in the darkness. In perfect Spanish, the driver of the vehicle asked the witness for directions to a particular road nearby. Unnerved but still captivated by this strange situation, the witness suggested to the driver that the cars follow him on his motorbike as he could lead them in the right general direction. The cars followed the witness for some distance down the road before eventually disappearing from view. Thus ended an incident in which a UFO seemed to change its shape before the eyes of the witness, from an orb to a saucer to a truck, and finally to two cars, complete with well-dressed if rather unusual occupants. Like the Yuma, Arizona case 4 years prior, this incident also featured the Oz factor, in which the immediate environment seems somehow enveloped by an unnatural silence. As with many UFO cases, it's also impossible to draw conclusions about the nature that was witnessed and experienced in these two incidents, but both exhibit aspects of what is known as high strangeness, in which UFOs seem to be anything but simply nuts and bolts vehicles, which are capable of assuming apparently any form they choose, and which seem to exhibit a psychic awareness of the actions and intent of the witnesses with whom they so mysteriously interact.
Is our government in the possession of a crash retrieval that was made not on planet Earth?
We have a pretty good idea where those things were taken. It's not a secret anymore that those things have been retrieved. They've been retrieved all over the world by special teams. They've been taken to the best labs.
The Ukrainian researchers said, we see these UAP under all kinds of visible conditions, a lot of the time in lots of different locations.
We also have the Webb telescope that can look at such an object from a different direction than the observatories on Earth.
The myths are consistent with oftentimes referred to as the gods.
And there's a lot more going on here, not just on this planet, but on other planets.
I think this is the arc of the covenant.
There were actually multiple arcs.
History isn't what we've been taught, and we're going to get to the bottom of it.
What evidence is there that the huge advances in technology that have occurred recently, certainly within a human lifespan, may have come from interactions with aliens? As I'm sure you know, the idea of cultures getting a technological boost from other civilizations isn't new. For example, we're familiar with the proposal that ancient Egypt borrowed ideas extensively from other cultures, resulting in their astounding explosion of technology. Even a recent suggestion that a critical aspect of pyramid building was actually invented 2,000 years earlier on the islands known as the Orkneys, off the coast of Scotland, and taken by seafarers via Crete in the Mediterranean to Egypt. As regards our recent advances, actually leaps in science and technology, it has been theorized for many years that the United States has been reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology since as early as 1942, including, critically, research into anti-gravity. Those interested in the subject of UFOs will have heard of the Roswell incident, but this was actually preceded by another flying saucer crash at Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 1942. A local preacher, Reverend William Huffman, was called out one night to perform last rites over the victims of what he was told was an airplane crash. When he arrived, he found that the airplane was a craft in the shape of a disc. There were 3 non-human victims of the crash that looked like the typical greys, and the craft had strange runic hieroglyphs all over it. Local fire department records show that there was a fire truck dispatched to the scene on the night of the accident, and that the firefighters were forced to sign military non-disclosure agreements about what they saw there. Dr. Bob Wood, who was probably the world's foremost authority on UFOs at the time, having been assigned to investigate the phenomenon for the Douglas Aircraft Company, found documents in the National Archives referring to the incident at Cape Girardeau. Fibre optic cables were found running all through the ship, and this discovery was the inspiration for the reverse engineering of the fibre optic technology that would not appear in public until almost 30 years later. During World War II, the Nazis had allegedly been working on anti-gravity flying discs. This was to be Germany's superweapon, as the atom bomb was America's. But America beat Germany to the punch, and it is theorized that the Nazis never finished the technology, at least in Germany. In the wake of the war, however, Operation Paperclip brought these same Nazi scientists over to America, where they were promised immunity from prosecution for their war crimes if they would finish their anti-gravity projects for the US military. Then, in 1947, the Roswell crash happened, and the Nazis were able to incorporate ET technologies into their designs. The most famous Nazi scientist of all, Wernher von Braun, claimed that he was shown the Roswell crash site and debris along with alien bodies. He was also heard to say that the explanation for the advanced state of German physics and aerospace development was that the Nazis had received help from some outside agency, implying aliens. Hermann Oberth, von Braun's predecessor and mentor, also expressed the same views.
We cannot take the credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped.
When asked by whom, he replied,
"The people of other worlds."
In another interview, he was quoted as saying,
"It is my thesis that flying saucers are real and that they are spaceships from another solar system. There is no doubt in my mind that these objects are interplanetary craft of some sort. I and my colleagues are confident that they do not originate from our solar system."
Within a decade of the events of 1947, we see the rise of the national security state in the US. The CIA was formed just a few months after Roswell, followed quickly by the NSA, DARPA, and the National Reconnaissance Office. According to documents leaked to UFO researcher Jaime Shandera in 1984, it was also during this time, 1952 to be exact, that Majestic 12, or MJ-12, was allegedly formed. The documents leaked to Shandera were a national security briefing to then President-elect Eisenhower, and they confirmed that the object that had crashed near Roswell was indeed a flying saucer. The briefing memo describes the aliens, which were referred to as extraterrestrial biological entities, or EBEs, as being small, large-headed grey aliens, and states that they are from the binary star system Zeta Reticuli. The documents also reveal a secret committee of 12, authorized by US President Harry S. Truman in 1947, which handled all matters pertaining to aliens. They explained how the crash of an alien spacecraft at Roswell in 1947 had been concealed, how the recovered alien technology could be exploited, and how the United States should engage with extraterrestrial life in the future. Later, an even more revealing document emerged, the Majestic 12 Special Operations Manual. It was subtitled Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology, Recovery and Disposal. Basically, this was a how-to manual for dealing with a crashed alien spacecraft and possible survivors. Its purpose was to provide instructions to military recovery units about the background of this top-secret program and how to handle the extraterrestrial craft parts, EBEs, and related propulsion and weapon systems, while deceiving the public and media by saying that nothing important had crashed. The period from 1952 to 1957 has been called the Golden Age of Anti-Gravity in the US. The sudden surge of interest in this technology was driven by what should have been one of the most spectacular events in UFO history, but which today is largely forgotten. On the night of July the 20th, 1952, a swarm of UFOs buzzed the White House, and it happened again a week later over the following weekend. The first incident started with just 7 UFOs, which air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport spotted on radar 120 miles south of the city and approaching rapidly. The senior air traffic controller on duty at the time, Harry Barnes, said that he knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were very different than those of an ordinary aircraft. After confirming that the radar was operating normally, Barnes called the backup radar center. It not only confirmed the radar sighting, but also that one of the objects could actually be seen from the control tower. The operator there, Howard Coughlin, told Barnes that he could see a bright orange object moving erratically. And as they spoke, the radar screen erupted with multiple new contacts. When these radar targets slowed down and began moving over the Capitol building and the White House, Barnes became alarmed and called Andrews Air Force Base, about 10 miles from the National Airport. The officers at Andrews said that they had nothing on their radar, but they did confirm visual sightings of the craft. One airman reported that while he was running to alert other personnel, he saw an object like an orange ball of fire trailing a tail, which took off at an unbelievable speed. About an hour into the sighting, Andrews' radar was also picking up multiple objects. One question that arises from this is, did it really take that long for the radar to detect the objects? Or did it just take that long for the commanding officer to admit it? The order was given to scramble Air Force fighter jets to investigate. It's interesting that it took the Air Force so long to respond. You'd think a violation of Washington, D.C. airspace would be the greatest possible threat to America's national security and would warrant an immediate response. Was the Air Force hoping that the UFOs would just go away so they could pretend that nothing had happened? Around the time the planes took off, Air Force witnesses reported seeing multiple objects that appeared to hover and then make an abrupt change in direction and altitude. These manoeuvres would have been impossible for any conventional aircraft. Some witnesses said that the objects appeared to be balls of orange light. Others reported massive silvery disc-shaped objects. At one point, all three radars, the two at National Airport and the one at Andrews, triangulated and tracked a solid object hovering over a radio beacon, only to have it abruptly disappear from their screen. It didn't fly off at high speed, it simply disappeared. Once the Air Force jets arrived on the scene, all of the intruder craft disappeared from the radar scopes. As soon as the jets left to refuel, the flying objects reappeared and started buzzing the Capitol again. This cat-and-mouse game continued for the next several hours, until dawn came and the aerial objects left for good. As you might expect, the reaction from the press the next day was explosive. It was all over the news. As perhaps you might not expect, there was no reaction from the government. General Roger Ramey of the US Air Force told the press that the objects were mirages caused by temperature inversions and that the radar operators had simply mistaken them for solid flying objects. However, the radar personnel said that they were familiar with weather artifacts and what was on the radar were craft of some kind, most likely solid metallic objects. After the unexplained flyovers of Washington, D.C. in July 1952, the US government seemed to go into panic mode. Within months, new and powerful agencies were created or given bigger budgets, seemingly in response to the events of that summer. Operation Paperclip, the importation of German scientists and engineers, was dramatically accelerated, over the objections of President Truman, by the way. The US had just been shown that some power, possibly extraterrestrial, had vastly superior aircraft that could enter and leave Washington, D.C. airspace at will. The UFOs represented a possible enemy against which the US had no defense, so the Air Force used every means at its disposal to develop effective counter-technologies. T. Townsend Brown, an American inventor and engineer, allegedly discovered a way to create anti-gravity through electricity in 1929. However, by then Einstein and relativity had taken hold of physics, and that camp said that there was no connection between gravity and electricity, so Brown's device was, quote, impossible, despite producing repeatable results under experimental conditions. Brown continued to develop and refine his inventions over the next 23 years, despite being ignored by the scientific establishment. But the events of 1952 made the US government much more receptive to Brown's ideas, and this led to a flood of anti-gravity research. Not only was Brown pitching his ideas to industry and military leaders, but pretty much every company in the defense sphere of operations got into the act. There are extensive newspaper articles from the period which identify the US government's interest in anti-gravity propulsion, and it's pretty obvious that they were playing catch-up. There are even notices from the Glenn L. Martin Aerospace Company looking for engineers interested in developing anti-gravity propulsion systems. During this same period, the US military opened a number of laboratories dedicated to the study of anti-gravity. One of the most prominent was the Aeronautical Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There was also the Research Institute for Advanced Study. All of this research lasted for about 5 years in the middle of the 1950s, and then suddenly, all went silent. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what happened. The military encouraged all of these anti-gravity ideas, and then, after they'd got all the detailed proposals, they threw up a wall of secrecy around the whole subject and took it private. And they've probably been working on developing the technology in secret for decades now. In 1988, there was a crack in the wall of secrecy surrounding the US Air Force development of anti-gravity craft. A man named Brad Sorensen went to an air show at Norton Air Force Base, where somehow he got mixed up with a group of VIPs. The group was taken to a hangar, off limits to the public. Inside were 3 flying saucers hovering above the floor. They were perfectly still and perfectly silent. The VIPs were told that they were alien reproduction vehicles, copies, in other words, and under development by Lockheed. Ben R. Rich, aeronautical engineer and the father of stealth, is more of an enigma now than he was during his lifetime. He's most noted for designing a stealth fighter plane that flew undetected by radar, and for his role as the second director of Lockheed Martin's top-secret Skunk Works program. Born in 1925, Ben passed away in 1995, with controversy still brewing amongst his friends, critics, and those who heard him speak publicly about UFOs and extraterrestrials. Prior to his death, Ben had allegedly made a number of interesting statements, one of which was, "We now have the technology to take ET home in our own craft."
During the first half of August 1947, Professor L.R. Johannes was in a small village called Ravio near Villa Santina in Carnia, Friuli. In his boyhood, he spent a large part of the summers in that district, where he was consequently well known. On the morning of August the 14th, 1947, as usual, he was making his way again up the short valley of the mountain stream called the Charisso. This valley ends up on the lower slopes of the central mountain massif, the Carnico del Gol Gentile. He had with him a small knapsack and his geologist's pick. He was following a path along the left bank of the stream, which was almost dry, which winds up through clumps of fir trees and deposits of alluvial rubble and detritus. On his right, the face of the mountain, with a gradient of about 45 degrees, towered away, consisting of fractured and weathered rock mixed with layers of gypsum. As he emerged from one of these clumps of fir, he noticed on the rocky riverbank at a distance of about 50 meters a large, lenticular object of a vivid red color. He was slightly short-sighted, and so he quickly put his glasses on. When he arrived at a spot a few steps distant from the thing, he was able to establish that it was a disc, seemingly of varnished metal, like the metal of an ordinary toy, having the shape of a lens. At its tip, a sort of shining metallic antenna of telescopic form was protruding, roughly similar to those we have on our present-day motor cars. And here he stated straight away that he knew nothing whatsoever in those days of flying saucers, and he didn't think that the Italian newspapers had even started to talk about them. The object, some 10 meters wide, was embedded to the extent of about a quarter of its length in a great transverse cleft in the friable rock of the mountainside, and was at a height of about 6 meters above the bed of the stream. Without much ado, he decided that he would climb up there and see what it was. But first of all, and anyone else would have done the same, he looked around to see whether there was anybody about who, should the need arise, could help him. And it was then that he perceived at a distance of 50 meters or so from him, right on the edge of the grove of trees from which he had just emerged, 2 boys. At any rate, that's what they seemed to be at first. He shouted to them and pointed to their disc, and then he started towards them. When he had halved the distance between them and himself, he stopped, petrified. The 2 boys were dwarfs. the likes of which he had never seen nor even imagined. They were coming towards him slowly, with tiny strides, with their hands at their sides and their heads motionless. When they had come to a few paces from him, they halted. He had no strength left. He seemed to be paralyzed, but he was still able to observe every detail. And those details have remained impressed upon him so indelibly that even now he could make a portrait of these extraordinary beings. However, he does confess that the dominating sentiment in him was that of enormous astonishment combined with fear, as you can well understand. They were no more than 90 centimeters in height and were wearing dark blue colored overalls made of some material that he would not know how to describe. Translucent is the only term for it. They had collars and rather deep belts, all of a vivid red color. Even the cuffs and the shins of the legs ended in collars of the same type. The heads, according to the impression that he got, were bigger than the head of a normal man and gave them a caricaturist aspect. They had no signs of hair, but in place of it, they were wearing a sort of big brown tight-fitting cap, like an alpinist bonnet. The skin of their faces was an earthly green. The only color that comes close to that is of the plasticine commonly used by sculptures of clay dipped in water. The nose was straight, geometrically cut and very long. Beneath it was a mere slit, shaped like a circumflex accent, which he saw opening and closing again at intervals, very much like the mouth of a fish. The eyes were enormous, protruding and round. Their appearance and color were like the color of two well-ripened yellow-green plums. In the center of the eyes he noticed a kind of vertical pupil. He saw no traces of eyebrows or eyelashes, and what he would have called the eyelids consisted of a ring midway between green and yellow, which surrounds the base of those hemispherical eyes, just like the frame of a pair of spectacles. Johannes remained there in astonishment, for what seemed to him to be an amazingly long time, gazing at the two extraordinary creatures. Only later he was able to calculate roughly how long it was. He thought the silent confrontation lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Then he noticed he could move and raised his arm and waved it in their direction, and then in the direction of the disc. In an agitated voice, he shouted and asked who they were, where they came from, and if he could help them. They wheeled round very quickly, and he can't remember what he said after that, for things began to happen fast. He believes that the two beings had interpreted his gestures as being threatening to them, but he didn't know for sure. What is certain is that one of them raised his right hand to his belt, and from the center of the belt there came something that seemed as though it may be a thin puff of smoke. Before he had time to move or do anything, he found himself laid out full length on the ground. Only once in his life had he had the experience of suffering a violent electric shock. That was in 1924, when he was a student at a technical institute, and the professor made them all form a chain to take the charge from a Leyden jar. As soon as he was struck by the smoke, he felt a similar sensation. Moreover, he felt himself deprived of all strength, and all his efforts to raise himself meant an expenditure of energy that was beyond him. Meanwhile, the two midgets were coming towards him, and they halted at a spot 2 meters from him. He managed to roll over onto his side, and he saw that they had green hands. They had 8 fingers, 4 on each hand. It wasn't a hand, it was a claw, and the fingers were without joints. He noticed that the chests of the two beings were quivering like a dog's chest when it pants after a long run. He made fantastic efforts to get up and finally managed a sitting position, but he had to brace his arms against the ground so as not to fall back again. Meanwhile, the two entities had arrived beneath the disc. He saw them climb up, slowly but surely, to the cleft in the rock and disappear into the disc itself, which was embedded almost vertically in the rock. A few more minutes elapsed, and then the strange object shot straight out from the rock and rose into the air. A cascade of stones and earth fell down onto the bed of the river, and that was the only noise that broke the silence in that lonely spot. The disc remained there stationary in the air, like an enormous suspended gong. He could distinctively see its sharply cut flange 4 or 5 meters from him, and for a moment he was seized with terror that it was going to come down on him and cut him in half like a worm. He made every effort to get up and escape. The result was he kept falling back again, supine and racked with pain. Meanwhile, the disc had tipped slightly away from its vertical position. Then it suddenly grew smaller and vanished. Immediately afterwards, he was struck by a tremendous blast of wind, which rolled him over and over on the ground and filled his eyes with dust. He ended up against the stones in the riverbed and remained there for a while. Finally, he managed to get into a sitting position again, and it was then that he looked at his wristwatch. It was 9:14 a.m. But it was only about midday that he was in a fit state to get back home. In the meantime, he even slept for an hour. His bones all felt as if they were broken and trembling, as though after a fearful bout of drinking. He looked in his rucksack for his thermos flask of coffee and was not surprised to find it shattered to pieces. But what did surprise him more was not being able to find any trace of its metal casing. Also gone were his aluminium fork and an aluminium can that had contained his cold lunch. Everything had been soaked with coffee, including a pack of cards he usually carried with him. He had to be content with bread soaked with coffee and throw away the salami and all the rest. At 2 p.m. he reached Ravello and went to bed. The next morning, Johannes armed himself with a pick and revolver and went back to the spot. There was nobody there. He climbed right up to the cleft in the rock, but he found nothing. At the time, Johannes tried to explain his strange adventure in many different ways, but none of them having anything to do with flying saucers or other craft of extraterrestrial origin. At first he thought the saucers were an experimental machine of the Allied forces, which were then in occupation of the camp of Ormedo Aerodrome in the Friuli area. His next thought was of some device of Russian origin. He wondered about some unknown civilization still hidden away in some unexplored regions of the world like the Mato Grosso of Brazil. The most absurd hypothesis could be adapted to fit his extraordinary adventure, but none of them was satisfactory, since none of them could account for the presence of those two little men. Anybody else in his position would have decided that the only sensible thing to do was to say absolutely nothing whatever to anybody about what had happened, and this is what he did, quite consciously. He had no wish to be considered a crazy visionary or worse. 2 months later, Johannes sailed for New York. During the crossing, he heard for the first time about the flying saucers seen by Kenneth Arnold. Only then he realized that he'd seen a flying saucer. During his 5 years in the USA, he followed with the greatest of interest all developments in the flying saucer story, and in 1950 he decided to relate his experience to others. In 1952, before returning to Italy, Johannes read an article in the weekly review, Europeo, about the book by Frank Scully, who spoke of 2 flying saucers that had landed in America and, as he stated quite clearly, contained the corpses of little men. Then he sent a letter from New York to the editor of Europeo, asking them to publish the account of his experience, which at any rate possessed the merit of priority in time. When, 2 months later, he returned to Italy, he went to Milan and called upon the director of Europeo. There he was told that the subject was an interesting one, but that in order that it could be published, it was necessary to furnish proofs of its authenticity. Johannes replied that if on that morning in August 1947 he'd imagined that he was going to encounter creatures from another world, he certainly would not have hesitated for one moment to take along with him a whole troop of journalists, cinematographers, why not, a company of soldiers too. There are intelligent beings that are coming from outer space and have been observing us for years, perhaps for centuries. Perhaps there will be beings similar to us. Others might be very different from us regards their physical aspect. We must be ready at any time for meetings with these beings and ready to demonstrate that we are civilized. When? Perhaps tomorrow, or perhaps in 2 centuries from now.